quick. Tell me the story of the Old Testament. Not a story from the Old Testament, not David and Goliath, not Noah's Ark. The story, the whole thing, beginning, middle, and end. What is the Old Testament about? If that question seems hard to answer, you're not alone. Most of us know the pieces, but we just don't know how to put them all together because we've never been shown. Today, we fix that. Welcome back to OT in Context. I'm Scott Smith. In our first episode, we talked about why modern readers struggle with the Old Testament. Then we looked at why geography matters and how the story is grounded in real places. Last time, we even got hands-on with the app. But before we go any further, we need to step way back and look at the big picture. Because if you don't know the shape of the whole story, every individual story is going to feel disconnected. And that's exactly how many of us experience the Old Testament, as a jumble of disconnected pieces. Here's how I describe my experience with the Old Testament for much of my life. Imagine someone hands you 1,000 puzzle pieces, but no box lid, no picture to reference. You've got some David and Goliath pieces over here and a pile that looks like they have to do with the Exodus. You've got a whole bunch of prophet pieces you're not quite sure what to do with. A whole bunch of names you can't pronounce, a bunch of kings that you just can't keep straight, and a talking donkey somewhere in the middle. Each piece makes sense on its own, or at least it's a story. David was brave, Moses parted the sea, Daniel survived the lions. Great, but where does each one go? What's the picture on the box? For years, I had all these pieces in my mind, and honestly, I had a pretty decent understanding of each individual story, but I couldn't have told you how they fit together. I couldn't have drawn you the big picture. And if you can't see the big picture, there's a good chance you have an inaccurate picture. If we have all the right pieces in all the wrong places, I'm not sure how much that picture we end up with is actually worth. We've created a picture that was not the one that was given to us. We've got it all jumbled up. When you look at the Old Testament on a timeline, it spans thousands of years of human history. That's an enormous amount of time. And God didn't fill that time randomly. There's a structure. There's a plot. There's a story being told, and it's going somewhere very specific. So let me give you the box lid. The big picture of the entire Bible, Old and New Testaments together, can be described in 4 words. Creation. God made everything. He made the world. He made humanity. And he placed them in his presence. Everything was good. Everything was exactly as it should be. God's people in God's place under God's rule. Fall. Humanity rebelled. Adam and Eve chose autonomy over obedience. And the relationship between God and his creation was broken. Not just for them, but for everything that came after. Sin entered the world, and with it came death, conflict, exile, and separation from God. Redemption, and this is where the Old Testament lives. Almost the entire Old Testament is a story of God working out his plan to redeem or to buy back what was lost. Not through a quick fix, not by pressing a reset button, but through a long, patient, unfolding plan that involves real people in real places making real choices over thousands of years. And that plan has a destination. Restoration. The story ends with God making all things new. The broken relationships fully repaired. God's people back in God's presence, under God's rule, permanently. That is where everything is heading. Now here's what I want you to see. The Old Testament isn't a random collection of stories. It's the longest act in a 4-act drama. And it's the act where God is doing the hard, slow, beautiful work of redemption. Every story you know from the Old Testament, it's a scene in that act. And once you know the act that you're reading, every scene makes more sense. Now, if someone asked me, what holds this story together? Or what's the mechanism that God uses to advance this plan? The answer is covenants. A covenant is basically a binding agreement, a formal commitment between two parties, initiated and guaranteed by God. And he made several of them throughout the Old Testament, each one building on the last, each one narrowing the focus of his redemptive plan. After the flood, God made a covenant with Noah, preserving creation itself. The rainbow wasn't decoration, it was a covenant sign. God was saying, I will sustain the world long enough to see my plan through. Then God called Abraham and made a covenant with him, land, descendants, and a blessing that would extend to all nations. This is where the story gets specific. God isn't working through all of humanity anymore. He's choosing one family, one line, through which his plan will come. At Sinai, God made a covenant with Israel through Moses, the law. This covenant defined what it meant to be God's people. It set them apart. And it also showed them, and us, that we cannot keep God's law perfectly. We need something more. Then God made a covenant with David, promising that a king from David's line would reign forever. Not just over Israel, forever. Do you see what's happening? Each covenant gets more specific. Creation, one family, one nation, one king, and eventually one person. Every covenant in the Old Testament is like an arrow, and they're all pointing in the same direction. The whole Old Testament is narrowing down, zeroing in, and building toward someone. And if you've read the New Testament, you know who arrives at the end of that narrowing. And it's not just the covenants. The Old Testament is filled with patterns, what scholars call typology, where people and events foreshadow what's coming. Think about Joseph, betrayed by his own brothers, left for dead, and then raised up to a position of authority where he actually saves the very people who rejected him. Sound familiar? Think about Moses, a deliverer who leads God's people out of slavery, through the waters, and toward a promised land. Or think about the Passover lamb, an innocent animal whose blood protects God's people from death. These aren't coincidences. They're not just nice stories. They're certainly not allegories we're inventing. They're patterns that the text itself establishes, divinely woven into the story so that when Jesus finally arrives, the people who know their Old Testament can look back and say, oh, that's what it was all about. Remember what we talked about in episode 1, Jesus on the road to Emmaus, opening the scriptures and showing how all of it pointed to him? This is what he was showing them. The covenants, the types, the patterns, the promises. One story told across thousands of years through dozens of authors, all converging on a single person, himself. The most concise summary I've heard of the Bible's message is 3 words. God saves sinners. That's it. That's the story. And the Old Testament is where you watch that plan unfold, slowly, patiently, and with an incredible amount of detail. So here's what I want this to do for you going forward. The next time you read a story from the Old Testament, I want you to ask yourself, where does this fit? What act am I in? What has God already promised and what hasn't happened yet? When you read about Abraham, you're watching God choose a family. When you read about the Exodus, you're watching God rescue a nation. When you read about David, you're watching God establish a throne. When you read about the exile, you're watching God discipline his people, but never abandon them. It's one story. It always has been. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every psalm, every prophecy, every battle, every genealogy, they all have a place in this narrative. They're not random. They're not filler. They're scenes in the greatest story ever told. We've now covered the 3 foundations you need for this series. Why the Old Testament matters, where it happened, and what the story is about. In the next episode, we're going to zoom in on a specific piece of geography that shaped everything, the land of Canaan. Why did God place his people there in that particular spot? What made it so strategically valuable and so dangerously exposed? The answer will change how you read almost every book of the Old Testament. If this series is helping you, I'd love for you to subscribe and share it with someone in your Bible study or small group or a friend who might find it interesting. And if you want to explore this story for yourself, trace the covenants, see the timeline, follow the people and the places, and understand how it all fits together, check out my app, OT in Context, at otincontext.com. I'm really glad you're here. I'll see you next week.